It's unusually cool on the morning of July 27th, 1979, in Houston, Texas. Summer anywhere in Texas is hot, but in 1979, Houston was sweltering. Houston is a large city in the southeast of Texas, near the Gulf of Mexico, and much of it is built on forested land, marshes, or swamps. In the summer, the temperatures can hit the hundreds in Fahrenheit, high 30s in Celsius for all our non-American listeners. That year, it also might have felt hotter than normal, because the city was quickly becoming more and more crowded. In the 1970s, Houston experienced a huge oil boom that changed the city forever. Shell Oil relocated its corporate headquarters to Houston in 1971, and hundreds of young people all over the country flocked to the city looking for work. With all these new people coming to Houston, apartment complexes began popping up. One of those complexes was the Orchard Apartments. Made up of several attached three-story buildings, the Orchard Apartments had 534 units. The buildings almost resembled motels, with unit doors opening to outdoor hallways or directly into a parking lot. 40-year-old Bob Smith had just pulled into the complex at 7:45 a.m. that morning because he was picking up one of his coworkers, 33-year-old Alice Elaine Runkin. They both worked for an engineering firm in Houston, and Bob had agreed to give Alice a ride to work because her car was in the shop being repaired. As I mentioned earlier, the complex was made of several three-story buildings, and if you lived on the first floor, your door opened directly to either a parking lot or an outdoor corridor. When Bob pulled up to Alice's apartment building, he waited in the parking lot for a few minutes and then walked to her door when she didn't come out. He noticed that the door to her unit, number 409, was slightly ajar. Bob walked up to the door and knocked, and he called out for Alice, but he heard nothing. The apartment was silent, nothing to suggest that Alice was gathering her things to leave for work. Bob pushes the door open, and that's when he sees that Alice is still laying in bed, except she's naked, and she's covered in blood. As he walks closer to the bed, he sees that her feet have been bound together by electrical cords, and her blankets and pillow are covering her upper body. Bob, panicking and wanting to check if Alice is still breathing, he lifts the pillow and blankets away from her face. And that's when he comes to the horrifying realization that the pillow is not covering her face, because her face, or more specifically, her head, is gone. Alice Runkin was the first victim of a killer that would come to be known as the Houston Decapitator. And she would not be the last of his victims to live in that same apartment complex. This is the Orchard Apartment Murders. Hi, strangers. This is your host, Alexa Morrissey. I decided I was going to cover this case last year when I was first planning out the podcast because I just happened upon an article about a home invasion story that I knew almost nothing about. And when I started my research, I found out why I didn't know anything about it. Because there's barely any coverage out there. This is a case where I don't really know a lot of details about the victims, but I did my best with what I had, which was not a lot. Just a little peek into my research methods, I like to use archive sites like newspapers.com so I can look at the reporting that was happening during the active investigations. But when I searched Alice Runkin, Orchard Apartments, 1979, Houston, Texas, nothing came up from any Houston publications. Literally, my screen read, "No results found." I thought I had messed up the spelling or the date, but no. This case was just not in the local news somehow. When I expanded my search to other parts of Texas, like Dallas, Fort Worth, and Longview, there it was, reported on in detail. It was being covered, but just by the newspapers from other parts of the state. And while that might not sound super strange, you have to remember how big Texas is. For our listeners outside the US, Texas is about 268,600 square miles, 432 kilometers. It's twice the size of the entire country of Germany. So when I say I found it strange that central cities in Texas were covering it, but not in Houston, it's because it's basically like a murder happening in New York City, but it only being covered in Ohio. Even now, there isn't a ton of information out there about this case, and I really can't figure out why. Why weren't the Houston newspapers reporting on this case? And even now, there isn't a ton of information out there about it. But today I'm going to try to remedy that the best I can. Lock your doors and listen closely. This is Stranger in the House. Alice Elaine McDonald was born in Dallas, Texas on July 7, 1946. She married a man named John Graham Rankin in November of 1965, and together they had one daughter. The family moved to Houston during the economic boom, but divorced in 1978. After the divorce, Alice got a job as a secretary and moved into the Orchard Apartments, and she lived there until July of 1979, when she was brutally murdered. Now, lots of young single people were living at the Orchard Apartments at this time. The complex itself wasn't necessarily in a bad neighborhood or anything, but along with Houston's economic boom came a violent crime wave, the likes of which the city had never seen. As I mentioned earlier, in the 1970s, Houston had a huge increase in their population. But with more people comes more crime. That year, Houston's homicide rate had increased by 44%. According to the Tyler Morning Telegraph, 12 killings were reported in one 48-hour period in August of that year. The Orchard Apartments security was not great. And remember, everyone's doors opened to the outside. So for someone like Alice, who lived on the ground floor, it was quite dangerous considering the crime rate. The authorities arrive at Alice's apartment on the morning of July 27th, a little while after she is discovered by her coworker, Bob Smith. There are no signs of forced entry, which led police to believe that perhaps Alice knew her killer, or he had knocked on her door and pretended to be a maintenance man or something of that nature. A bloody butcher's knife and a small double-sided razor were found in the apartment. The butcher's knife had been taken from Alice's own kitchen, as there was an empty space in her butcher block. As they looked around the crime scene, police found a trail of blood from the side of her bed, through the apartment, and out the front door. It started with a large puddle and then became a thinner trail to the outside into the parking lot, and then stopped right by an empty space. When police could not find Alice's head in the apartment, they had to assume that the killer removed her head, placed it on the floor next to her bed where the puddle was, and then took it with him to his car in the parking lot. This blood trail suggested that this man walked from Alice's door to his car with her head in his hands for anyone to see. When Alice's body was examined, it was determined that Alice had been stabbed with the butcher's knife multiple times, and she was sexually assaulted. The medical examiner described the decapitation as, quote, sloppy, like the killer had struggled to remove her head. According to an article in the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, police theorized that her cause of death was actually strangulation, and all the other damage had happened post-mortem. Police extensively searched the area for Alice's head, but it was never found. Interviews with neighbors and friends didn't point them to any solid suspects either. Alice had no enemies, her ex-husband had an alibi, and she wasn't dating anyone. After the murder, the women in the area were terrified to walk home at night, and a record number of them bought guns to carry with them at all times. The property manager of the Orchard Apartments received several calls from tenants saying they were moving out immediately. Those who stayed at the Orchard Apartments had their door locks changed by management. 2 weeks into Alice's murder investigation, police get another call from the Orchard Apartments. Another woman had been found murdered in her apartment. An apartment that was 2 floors above where Alice was killed. On Friday, August 10th, 1979, 27-year-old Mary Michael Calcutta's body was discovered on her bathroom floor. Again, there were no signs of forced entry, and a bloodied butcher's knife was found at the scene. The police determined that the knife came from Mary's own kitchen, just like Alice's. Some sources say that Mary was sexually assaulted, others say that she was found fully clothed. She was not decapitated, but she was stabbed multiple times and had several deep knife slashes on her throat, suggesting that the killer had perhaps started to decapitate her, but was scared off by something. The stab wounds were said to be the cause of death, and it appeared that Mary's death was much more violent than Alice's. Mary had extensive defensive wounds all over her. According to a detective named James Binford, quote, "Mary Calcutta died harder than any murdered woman I have ever worked. She fought her killer from the front door until she couldn't fight him anymore. He stabbed her with such force that it went all the way through her, and it bent the blade." Mary was another single woman living alone at the Orchard Apartments. She was originally from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and had fallen in love with Houston. Like so many young people at the time, Mary had hoped to find work in the city. She had made friends in the area, and it was actually one of those friends who discovered her body after arriving to pick her up for an outing. At the same time police were examining Mary's crime scene, an exterminator was walking into the northwest Houston townhouse of 26-year-old Doris Lynn Threadgill, which was about 8 miles north of the Orchard Apartments. The exterminator was there for a scheduled appointment, so when he found the door to the townhome unlocked, he just let himself in. Unfortunately, when he entered the home, he found Doris's body. Like the other women, she had been stabbed and her throat had been slashed so deeply that her head was nearly removed from her body. There were a couple of differences between the two murders at the Orchard Apartments and Doris's. One, there have never been any reports of Doris being sexually assaulted. And two, the murder weapon was not found in the townhome. Now, remember when I said I found these cases kind of difficult to research because it didn't seem like anyone in Houston was covering it at the time? Well, I think it might have been because the Houston police were trying to keep any information about these investigations out of the public. 4 days after Mary and Doris were found, the Fort Worth Star-Telegram published an article quoting Detective James Binford. According to Binford, the police had no reason to believe that Doris's case was related to the Orchard Apartment murders. However, on the same day that article was published, the Tyler Morning Telegraph reported that Lieutenant Chuck Laughlin of the Houston Police was purposefully keeping information about the crimes out of the public because of the, quote, nuts that come in to confess. So it's possible that police were trying to keep the public in the dark about if these cases were related, so no false confessions came in from somebody wanting the fame of a serial killer. And just to be clear, the police are known to do this, and there's actually a really good reason why. According to an article on Slate.com by Dory Schaefer, police withhold evidence to help determine whether suspects catch are guilty. If a suspect possesses non-public information about a crime, it is likely that he either committed it or knows who did. And the suspect's knowledge of non-public information can be used against him in court. Months went by with no suspects. None of the women had enemies, and all 3 of them were known to mostly keep to themselves. But remember, the Houston's police resources were spread extremely thin because of the high crime rate at the time. So that might be the real reason why they didn't have any substantial leads. On the night of October 3rd, 1979, 5 blocks from Doris Lynn Threadgill's townhome, residents of Freed Park heard some alarming noises. A woman was screaming, and there were several gunshots heard. When police officers arrived and searched the scene, they told the residents who called them that there was no blood anywhere and they probably just mistook fireworks for gunshots. But it was the police who were mistaken, because that next morning, a cyclist found a body of a 16-year-old girl named Joanne Huffman, 4 miles away from where the screaming was heard. She had been shot in the mouth and was found abandoned near a picnic table in Wantonga Park. Around the time that police were investigating the site where Joanne was found, they get a call from a used car dealership nearby. An abandoned white Dodge, smeared with blood, was found in their lot. Inside the trunk, another decapitated body was found. The car and the body found in the trunk belonged to 18-year-old Robert Spangenberger, who was Joanne Huffman's boyfriend. From looking at the car, police believed that Robert was killed first, and after his body was put in the trunk, Joanne was forced into the car by the killer, and then she was taken to the park where she was killed. Robert was most likely decapitated after the killer had dumped Joanne's body. Just like Alice Runken, police searched and searched for Robert's head, but it was never found. Now, being a true crime lover has led me to ask some truly dark questions over the years. But while I was doing research for this case, I asked myself, for the first time, why would someone take a head? I mean, there is no point trying to rationalize an irrational person's actions, but still, there must be some sort of psychological reasoning behind the act. According to a paper called The Role of Forensic Investigation in an Unusual Case of Patricide by a Schizophrenic Woman Involving Dismemberment of a Decomposed Body, researchers suggest that there are 5 main different kinds of homicidal mutilation and dismemberment. The most common is referred to as defensive mutilation. This is to assist in hiding or moving a body, getting rid of evidence, or making identification of the victim more difficult. If a headless body is found in a remote area without any identification, it's going to be very hard for the police to ID them. The second category for dismemberment is called aggressive mutilation, where the mutilation is brought about by the same aggressive emotions that led the person to kill. So dismemberment or decapitation is part of the killing. A subset of this type might be where dismemberment is actually a form of torture. The third most common category is usually referred to as offensive mutilation, where dismemberment is in fact the real purpose of the murder all along. These include lust and necrosadistic murders. Death by strangling is also very common in this kind of homicide. This is the category in which I think the Orchard Apartment murders lie. We know that Alice was strangled and sexually assaulted, so there is a sexual nature to these crimes. The decapitations were obviously not defensive, as they were not done to hide the victims' identities. Alice, along with the 2 other women, were found in their own homes. Even Robert was found in his own car. The decapitations were also not likely to be of an aggressive manner, as the dismemberment happened after the victims were killed, and were not used as a form of torture. And if decapitation was part of the motive for these crimes, it would make sense why the killer would keep them as a trophy or hide them where only he could find them. And just for your knowledge, the 4th category is psychotic mutilation, where the perpetrator has lost touch with reasoning and perceptual reality. And the 5th are kinds of killings associated with organized crimes, such as the mafia, where mutilation and dismemberment are a way of sending a message to others. It's a form of communication. In 2010, cold case investigators sent DNA evidence from the 2 headless victims, Alice and Robert, to a private lab to be examined. Unfortunately, there was no useful information found, and that's possibly because of the way DNA was stored in the 70s and 80s, a time when DNA wasn't even known about yet. As of now, 45 years later, police are still unsure if the 5 murders are connected, and if they are dealing with one killer or multiple. It's pretty widely assumed that the 2 Orchard Apartment murders were perpetrated by the same person. But as for the woman in the townhome and the teen couple, police are not quite convinced. Now, I am not a cop. The police are most likely withholding some information, and we have to take into account the extremely high crime rate in the city at the time. But I personally believe they are connected. I think Doris's murder in the townhome has too similar of an MO to the murders at the Orchard Apartments not to be connected. We have the same victim profile, single white women living alone in their late 20s, early 30s. All 3 women had been stabbed, and while Alice was the only one who had been decapitated, the 2 other women had extensive cuts on their throats that went so deep that a few more could have led to decapitation if the killer continued. And it's possible that the killer could have been scared off before he could finish. Doris was not sexually assaulted, and her murder weapon was not found in the home, but those are the only differences compared to the other two. Mary and Doris were killed the same day, and both were almost, but not successfully, decapitated. This is very much just a theory, but maybe after getting the satisfaction from Alice's murder and decapitation, the killer went back to the Orchard Apartments to find another victim. He chose Mary, but she made it so difficult by fighting so hard. What he couldn't recreate what he did with Alice on Mary that night, perhaps he was desperate to find a new victim to try again, which is maybe why he went a few miles away and targeted Doris. Now, the couple that was murdered in Freed Park might not be connected. The victim profile is different, there were two of them, and they were in their teens. And the man was decapitated rather than the woman. The woman was also shot with a gun, which is a completely different MO. The only reason why I think they might be related is the fact that decapitation is extremely rare in homicide cases. According to one paper called Decapitation, a Rare Form of Post-Mortem Mutilation, a study in South Australia revealed that over a 17-year period, only 20 cases of decapitation were reported, and 13 of those were suicides involving trains or vehicles, and the other 7 were accidental, resulting in explosions or industrial accidents. Less than 1% of murders involve decapitation, so it's hard to believe that 2 different people were carrying out decapitations in 1 year in the same city. And remember, this is the 70s, the golden age of serial killers. According to a Rolling Stone article called "Why Were There So Many Serial Killers Between 1970 and 2000, and Where Did They All Go?", out of all serial killers ever documented in the United States, nearly 80 of them were active between the years of 1970 and 1999. But, as I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of differences between the 3 cases and the murdered couple. So there's a very good chance they aren't connected, and it's just a really weird coincidence. Unfortunately, there is a good chance we will never find out. Every day we hear more and more about cold cases getting solved thanks to DNA databases and new technology, but with so little evidence left to examine from these cases, it's hard to see justice getting served. And it's truly heartbreaking because Alice Runkin, Mary Calcutta, Doris Threadgill, Robert Spangenberger, and Joanne Huffman deserve justice. And I hope, one day, by some miracle, they get it. Stay safe, strangers, and thanks for listening. This episode was written by Alexa Morrissey. Stranger in the House is a Boy Wonder production. All our sources will be linked in the show notes.